Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Game Plan. This is all about Thursday Night Football, the Indianapolis Colts versus the Houston Texans. Big game, huge playoff implications, and for a change, I'm actually ahead of schedule so I can post this on a Wednesday before the game, or the day of the game, I should say. If you're new to this show, here's what I do. I break down the current injuries for both teams. I look at the stats. I look at the gambler stats. I'll explain those. We'll look at the path to victory for both the Colts and the Texans, and then we'll finish it up with my fantasy football projections, my computer analytics, and we'll talk about those as well. As I always say at this point, please give me 2 seconds of your time for 2 clicks, a like and a subscribe. We need to grow our channel to unlock some production features. We need your support to do that, so please, it's a little bit of effort for you. It goes a long way for us. But let's dig in like we always do. We start with the key injuries for both teams. You can see I'm not really comfortable with either team right now in where they are injured. You see Marlon Mack, he's out. Jonathan Williams, Nyheim, Hines, the combination of those two probably going to be filling in. You got T.Y. Hilton and Paris Campbell. T.Y. Hilton is now questionable. That's good that he's kind of on the mend, but Paris Campbell is still out. Eric Ebron is questionable, although I expect him to play. On the Texans side, Will Fuller, in my opinion, he's key to this offense. We'll talk about that a little bit later. He's questionable. Titus Howard, questionable. And then you look at the secondary, my goodness, for the Houston Texans. That is ugly. You got Reed, doubtful. You got Gibson, questionable. Roby, questionable. Johnson, questionable. Hopefully the last 3 play. Hopefully all 4 play. But, basically you got the Titans... Not the Titans, I apologize. The Texans defensive backs hurt, and then you got the Colts wide receivers hurt, and then of course you have Mack who's in there. But both offensive lines are looking okay, with the exception of Titus Howard. But we'll see how that moves forward. Let's move it on right now to the position kind of, or I should say the offensive and defensive unit contests here, and I like to put passing offense versus passing defense and vice versa through the run offense. These numbers, these ranks are in terms of yards accumulated throughout the year or yards per game, because I know some teams have had and have not had bye at this point. But you see the Colts right now, 28th ranked passing offense versus the 29th ranked passing defense. Both are bad. You have the 11th ranked passing defense on the Colts versus the 14th ranked passing offense for the Texans. Frankly, I expected the Texans to have a better passing ranking than this in terms of yards accumulated, but again, they've been banged up. There have been some issues there. Then you look in the run side. The Colts run offense is 4th, not surprising based on that offensive line, but once again, Marlon Mack is out, the best of their running backs. The 13th ranked run defense for the Texans, and then you have the 5th ranked run offense for the Texans versus the 9th ranked run defense. So basically, it's offensive and defensive line. These two teams are battling. The passing offense, I think which team passes better, I don't know. If I had to give basically kind of an advantage here based on just the passing and the run defense, run offense, passing offense, all that stuff, I would give it a slight edge towards the Texans, with the caveat that, depending on how these injuries shake out, obviously if T.Y. Hilton can play, that, helps the Colts. If a couple of those defensive backs can't play or the safeties can't play for the Texans, that hurts their ranking, obviously. So there is going to be a little bit of moving parts. Make sure if you're playing fantasy, check out NFL.com/inactives or go to your favorite fantasy news provider to make sure, which players are healthy. See that. Always check into that before you go ahead. Now let's move it to the gambler stats. If you're not familiar, if you're new to the show, gamblers basically look at a few things. There's always a long laundry list, but here's what they start with. They start with yards per play, both offensive and defensive. Basically, how efficient are you per play? Then they talk about, or they look into the 3rd and 4th down percentage. Okay, you can gain a lot of yards per play, but how are you in key situations, 3rd and 4th down? Can you stay on the field? Then even more key situations. Once you're in the red zone, what's your touchdown percentage versus, how many field goals are you attempting or turnovers or what have you, turnover margin. And then I added this week the penalty yards per game too, because there is a disparity that shows how disciplined you are generally. Although you can see at the bottom of the list there, 48 to 64. Although that does favor the Colts on that bottom pane, it's not really that much out of whack. But let's go back up top and let's talk about the offensive yards per play for the Colts. 5.2 yards per play. Given that their passing game is lower ranked in the league, you would expect expect that. And similarly to the Texans, they give up 6 yards per play. If you put those into an average, you're looking at a difference of 0.8. So you can expect the Colts to gain about 5.6 yards per play, give or take. And again, I know this is super high level. Then you look at the defensive yards per play. The Colts give up 5.5. The Texans acquire basically 5.9 yards of offense. If you look at that, it's 5.75 if you average those two out. So the yards per play favors the Texans just a little bit. Then you look at the third down percentage. The Colts stay on the field 42% of the time. That's a respectable percentage. The Texans get off the field 45% of the time. You look down, the Colts defense is better than the Texans third down defense. And I would say I would give the third down, the stay on the field type percentages, I would give those to the Colts, especially when you factor in the fourth down percentages there. So again, yards per play, a little bit towards the Texans. Situational football, a little bit towards the Colts. I don't think that's that surprising, frankly. If I had to rank head coaches, I like what Frank Reich is doing. I know he has less of a body work than Bill O'Brien does. And it's not that I dislike O'Brien. I just like Frank Reich. I respect him and the coaching staff a little bit more. So that's not surprising. If you look at red zone touchdown percentage, the Colts are at 63% offensively. The Texans are at 65% offensively. And you can see a trend in football, by the way. I mean, both of these teams run the ball very well. The good running teams generally have the higher percentages scoring the ball, and it's because you're two-dimensional and you can get tough yardage when all of the bodies are basically confined to a certain square yardage part of the field, right? Defensive-wise, you can see the Colts' defensive red zone percentage is much better than the Texans' red zone percentage. So again, yards probably more towards the Texans, situational football more towards the Colts. It looks a little bit even. So I look at those injuries. I think they're about even because they both have some key players that are banged up. We'll see once again who is healthy, before game time, who can go. You look at situational football, even down to the turnover margin, it's pretty close there. I say, man, this is a very, very close game. Now, on top of that, Houston opened as a 3-point favorite. So it was Houston Texans -3 against the Colts. You can see why. I mean, if this game was in Indianapolis, Indianapolis would probably be favored by a couple of points as well. I mean, Vegas sees these two teams as equal. If we look just at these analytics, I see these two teams as equal as well. But let's talk about the game plan, the paths to victory, because certainly, this game, again, analytically speaking, is kind of a toss-up. I will say from the mental approach, the Colts coming off a good win against Jacksonville, the Texans coming off a bad, I wouldn't say it's a bad loss to lose to Baltimore, but the way that they lost was pretty bad. So I know they're going to come back with some pride and they're going to play with some pride. So I like mentally Houston's point of mind or emphasis in this game as well. So let's go to first the Colts' path to victory, how I think that they will attack the Houston Texans and what I think they need to do to win. First and foremost, they are banged up at defensive back. I mentioned that before. With Marlon Mack out, and if T.Y. Hilton can't go, remember it's a short week, even though he's questionable. I think he's been limited. I don't know if he's going to go yet as of recording this video. But let's just say for argument's sake, both are out. You look at the Colts, and they're going to be trying to put a little bit more emphasis on Nyheim Hines out of the backfield. Certainly Jonathan Williams will be involved. But they're also going to be trying to hit short passing attempts. And you look at maybe what the Pittsburgh Steelers are doing right now. I would say the same is true with the exception that I think the Colts will utilize both tight ends a little bit more. Maybe a more accurate comparison would be the Philadelphia Eagles and what they're doing with Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert. And Eric Ebron, who's questionable, I know, in Jack Doyle, who was non-existent last week. Those two guys can keep the chains moving, and I think the Colts need to keep the chains moving, especially if Hilton and Mack are both out. They're going to need to involve some other guys. I don't think Pascal and Chester Rogers and all of the other receivers there for the Colts can get it done by themselves. They need both tight ends to help move the field. Use Jonathan Williams and Nyheim Hines. I mentioned Hines before, but I don't think it's just Jonathan Williams, though he had a great back half of the game after Mack went out. I do think they're going to need Hines. I do think we're going to see maybe not a committee running the ball, but both will be involved in this game. Hines certainly out of the backfield. So if you're looking for a PPR budget play, if you play daily fantasy or you're really desperate for a running back this week and you're in a PPR league, Hines I think would be an okay. I think there's better value out there, but I think he'd be an okay play as well. If Hilton can't go, Chester Rogers Rodgers needs to win his matchup. I think they need to test them deep. It goes back to that first point as well. I mentioned already using the tight ends, but the Colts need to take shots deep. Even if they can't complete them, they need to test this Texans secondary. They're giving up yardage. We saw that in the yardage comparison. They need to win over the top. Now, T.Y. Hilton, if he's in there, all of a sudden the complexion of this matchup changes a little bit, and they can hit T.Y. Hilton deep. But really, Pascal and Rodgers and whoever else they have on the outsides there, they need to test early and often the Texans, deep coverage. And even if they're not completing passes, I'm a big proponent of just throw it, just so that they have to respect it, and it'll open more things up in the running game. Open things up closer to the back or closer to the field for Brissett to still hit Hines, Ebron, and Doyle, kind of short and intermediate routes. Now, the path to success for the Texans. Look, Indianapolis has a tough run defense, as does the Texans, but they have to have success, I think, with screen passes. I think Duke Johnson, although I still think Carlos Hyde does well in this game and certainly could get in the end zone, I think Duke Johnson and Carlos Hyde should be used out of the backfield a little bit just to keep this Colts basically defensive line honest. Their linebackers are very good and fast, but stretch the field a little bit. The passing attack should be ranked higher than 14th when you have Watson and when you have Hopkins. Will Fuller, I mentioned him at the beginning. I really think he's a huge difference maker in this basically the strategy for the Houston Texans there. Now, when Fuller is in the game, he is so fast. He stretches the field, and Watson throws to him deep all the time. And I was just saying about the Colts, that even just putting on tape your willingness to take 4 or 5 deep shots a game to Will Fuller, the defense has to respect that. The safeties can't crash up. They can't, try to, take away Stills or QT or whoever's going to be running out of the slot there. They have to respect it. When they have to respect it, things in the intermediate open up. Suddenly, Fells has more windows to catch passes. He's going to have more windows in the red zone as well, so that's going to be there. And that brings me to my fourth point. Darren Fells has to be involved. I think he will be involved. It goes week to week, whether or not he's going to get 2 touchdowns or no touchdowns. But the bottom line is in the red zone, Deshaun Watson uses him, and I think he's actually going to be a nice play this week as well. So if you're looking for waiver wire tight end play, I think you're good there. And then keep the wide receivers in front of you. I was just talking about the Colts. They need to take deep shots. With a banged-up secondary, I believe that the Houston Texans, I'm not going to say play cover 2 or anything like that and drop, people deep and, play the bend, don't break, but just make sure that they don't get easy chunk yardage, especially if T.Y. Hilton's out. Just keep him in front of you. I mean, everything about this game is so close when you're talking about conversions. You don't need to take any stupid risks necessarily unless it's late in the game and, you need to situationally. I'm not going to say you need to steal possessions like I do, in other matchups. It's going to be a hard-fought game. I think it's going to be a close game. I kind of like the Texans to cover this spread just because of what they put on tape last week against the Baltimore Ravens. I just think they're going to be very, very motivated to come out. They're at home. It's going to be a big game. I think the winner of this game really can take advantage. Honestly, I think that the loser of this game might not have a shot to win the division because I do think the Tennessee Titans are going to be having a say, and all these teams are going to have to deal with basically 3 teams. And Jacksonville's no slouch with Nick Foles now either. These teams are going to beat up on each other. I think it's going to be one representative from this division to make the playoffs. Going to be interesting to see what shakes out there. But huge game. I don't love Thursday games, but as an NFL fan, I'm glad that we get to see it on prime time. Now let's conclude this with my fantasy football analytics. Again, if you're new to the show, I call it RoccoBot. It's the fantasy football analytics that I wrote to spit out computer projections. I don't always agree with these projections, so I use them to help me. Generally with daily fantasy, am I supposed to be spending a high budget on a player, or maybe should I be looking at somebody as a sleeper to rotate it as a daily fantasy sleeper, or the bottom of my flex? But I do like Jacoby Brissett this week to rebound. His knee looked good to me last week. He was able to be mobile there, so I liked him. Jonathan Williams, I think, will have some value. I don't think he'll have as much value as Mack would have had, but I still think he'll have some value this week. I mentioned Hines. I think he's definitely a fringe start this week in a PPR league. T.Y. Hilton, if he plays, I like him, and I like him as a touchdown candidate. Pascal and Rodgers, I mentioned, they have to win those battles. If Hilton plays, I do think that some things over the middle, maybe deep ends and those kinds of things will open up for them. And I mentioned Doyle earlier, but I think Ebron is the better of the tight ends, the more consistent of the tight ends in terms of drawing targets, and that's a big deal, obviously, in fantasy. You can't have a catch if you don't have a quarterback targeting you, right? I don't have a great projection on him this week. I do have him as a sit analytically, but I expect, especially if Hilton goes out, I expect him to exceed this expectation. And then defense and special teams, that's not a great number. I think Houston will be able to take care of the ball this week. I think the sacks might be few and far between this particular week, although I do love generally the Colts defense. I don't like their projection this week, so I'm going to stay away. Now, moving to the Houston Texans, I actually like Deshaun Watson quite a bit. Again, I think he'll bounce back. Carlos Hyde is a definite start for me. Duke Johnson, I mentioned, I'd like to see them use him more in screen passes. My analytics say that that's not going to be the case this week, or if they try it, it's not going to be very successful. We'll see what shakes out there, but I would sit Duke Johnson this week. DeAndre Hopkins, I like to get in the end zone once, possibly twice. If Will Fuller is in the game, I also like him in terms of just yards accumulated. I could see like a 3 or 4 catch, 120 yards type game, maybe even gets in the end zone. That'd be big. Kenny Stills is a no for me. Darren Fells is a yes for me. I think he's also a touchdown candidate. And then defense and special teams, again, although I like the Houston Texans, I don't love them this week. I think it's going to be one of those kind of a lower scoring game, which is good for defense, but I think it's going to be kind of a lower sack and a lower turnover game. So I think there's better value on the waiver wire out there for defense and special teams this week. So there you go. That takes me through my deep dive, my game plan for the Houston Texans and the Indianapolis Colts. Huge game. Let me know what you think the final score was going to be. I think it's going to be Houston 24, Indianapolis 20. Obviously, that's just kind of a number I threw out there based on some of these analytics, but it's seldom right. I came pretty damn close last week with the Cleveland score, but I missed the Pittsburgh score in the Thursday game last week. I also did not predict that a defensive lineman would swing a helmet at anybody, but that's just I don't have an algorithm for that. I don't have that plan. But yeah, check out our other videos we're going to be doing. Hopefully we're going to be doing 8 game plans this week. Very similar format. Actually, it's the same format across the board. Subscribe. Please comment. Let me know what you think the final score is going to be. If you think I'm missing a matchup here, please let me know. I love to hear your comments, especially from Colts fans and Texans fans. You're closer to the team than I am, although I do watch every team every week. I don't watch it as closely, and I'm not as much of a diehard as a Colts or a Texans fan. So let me know what you're thinking as well. I would love to hear it. And once again, please check us out on another episode soon. We'll see you then. Thanks.